Rachel, I want you to respond to this. Both the Huckabee that we see on the platform and the Huckabee we read about as he's dropping little poison pills on his rival in private interviews. Here he is today in the debate, talking about faith.
Two overriding principles are you treat others as you wish to be treated. As it relates in health care, that means that we recognize that a person who is sick shouldn't be treated differently because they're in poverty than a person who has extraordinary wealth. That we have some sense of balance in how we approach that. That's the essence of what America is about. The second basic principle is that inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. And as it relates to both health, education, or any policy, what it really means is that you go back to what the Founding Fathers said. All of us are created equal, endowed by our Creator with those rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
I guess the question there is, there's the good-sounding Huckabee, and then we read in the New York Times article the bad-sounding guy who's certainly bearing false witness against his Mormon neighbor, if you believe the Mormon Church.
Well, it's two sides of the same coin as far as I can tell. And the real substantive story here is that almost all of the Republican candidates have argued against the separation of church and state, have argued for it to be less, have argued that it's been overdone, that there ought to be more religion in the public sphere, and that candidates' religions ought not to be just seen as a private matter, which is what Kennedy argued in 1960. Once you cross that line, once you say that religion ought to be a public matter, yeah, you're going to get ugly attacks on one another's religions, particularly if you've got minority religion candidates in the race. This is what American politics look like if you get rid of the separation of church and state. I feel like this is a civics lesson for all of us.
Okay, man, I guess we've never really had full separation because the civil rights movement was led by ministers, wasn't it?
Well, the Republican Party seems to be arguing not against separation of church and state, Chris. They're arguing against the advancement of secularism. As Romney put it, some secularists, to his mind, almost want to establish a new religion. And so that's what their candidates are arguing against. This is a party in which religious faith is very important, and Huckabee has been able to exploit his fact that he's an ordained Baptist minister to appeal to these constituencies. He speaks their language much the same way that Governor George W. Bush spoke the language of Christian conservatives back in 1999 and 2000.
Do you think we should take, let me ask you, Rachel, now that we've raised this issue, just to show there's two sides to this debate. Do you think we should take In God We Trust off of our currency?
I think that there's no great harm that it's doing since it's already been there. I think if we were starting to advocate on it, if we were starting to debate on it right now, I would not argue for that being instituted now. I think we should accept it as tradition because I don't think it's doing any harm. But I think there's
one nation under God and the Pledge of Allegiance? Would you get rid of that?
Again, I'm not going to go out of my way to drop these things that already exist. But if we were arguing about it now, I'd say we do more of a favor to religion and religious freedom in this country to not have mentions of God in our publicly supported stuff.
Should we fire the Senate chaplain and the House chaplain in the Congress? Fire them. Get rid of them. Why pay a salary to somebody who's a religious person in the Congress of the United States? We pay for two of them. Why should we do it?
I'm not arguing for getting rid of the traditions that we have inherited. I'm not arguing that we ought to have more of them starting now. I think this is the wrong way to approach the debate because I don't think there really is a war of secularists on the United States. And if Mitt Romney says he's going to defend us against the encroaching battalions of secularism, I think he's going to be laughed off the political stage. I don't think that's a credible
threat. But the fact is, Chris, there are people who want to do all the things that you mentioned. So Rachel may not want to do them, but there are parties, special interests in America, who do want to achieve these goals. And so the Republican Party has found itself in the position of having to defend public expressions of religion that aren't overtly sectarian, for example, and don't, to any commonsensical view, don't erode the separation of church and state. So Rachel may not want to do them, but there are people who do. And so Romney is going to fight those guys.
If that's all they were fighting for, then there wouldn't be controversy about Mitt Romney saying, for example, that he wouldn't put a Muslim in his cabinet. There wouldn't be controversy about the Republican candidates calling America a Christian nation. That's the kinds of issues that are substantively what we're fighting about. Whether or not In God We Trust is on the money is a side issue.
Rachel, who said we're a Christian nation?
Almost every Republican candidate has made that claim at one point or another. I mean, Romney's argument centrally in his big speech on religion was that freedom requires religion. And that
Did he say we're a Christian nation? I think you're wrong.
He didn't say we're a Christian nation in that speech.
Did anybody say that? Did anybody say we're a Christian nation in this whole campaign?
In this campaign, that's a mainstream claim by Republican politicians.
No, I'm just asking if anybody. You just said that they say this. I want you to give an example of one who did. Well, name one Republican in this race for president who's called this a Christian nation.
I'll give an example. John McCain has said we have Judeo-Christian heritage, which is different, absolutely, from the kind of thing that Rachel is saying. It's a different idea to express American heritage than it is to make identity politics, as some people do on the religious right. There's no question about that.
Okay, let's take a look at Romney on the issue. Here's Romney avoiding what everybody in politics will always avoid, having to choose between two desirable identifications. Here he is.
We're not going to get the White House, nor strengthen America, unless we can pull together the coalition of conservatives and conservative thought that has made us successful as a party. And that's social conservatives, it's also economic conservatives, and foreign policy and defense conservatives. Those three together form the three legs of the Republican stool that allowed Ronald Reagan to get elected and allowed our party to have strength over the last several decades.
Well, it looks to me like, Matt, and then Rachel, that whatever your politics coming into this conversation, you two, it looks to me like Huckabee is beating Romney for the title of Christian conservative or cultural conservative candidate.
Well, I think he's already beat Romney for that title, and this is what forcing Romney to an interesting position. You know, in 2006, Chris, Mitt Romney was running as the turnaround artist. That's who he was. He changed the Olympics. He came into Massachusetts. He was able to get this health care reform.
He was pro-gay rights. He was pro-choice.
When he was running for governor of 2, he sure was. But he was a turnaround artist in terms of business and in terms of large enterprises.
He changed uniforms.
That's how he was going to be president.
Why did he change uniforms?
Because George Allen lost his Senate race in 2006, so Mitt Romney saw a spot. He was now going to run as the cultural conservative in the race. Right. But it never fit well. Now there is an actual authentic cultural conservative. His name is Mike Huckabee. I think this frees up Mitt Romney, Chris, to run as the turnaround artist.
You are so smart. Rachel, what do you think of Mitt Romney?
Thank you.
Do you think Mitt Romney really believes what he says, or he's just cross-dressing politically here?
I think that Mitt Romney does not have a great record of picking a position and sticking with it. I mean, that's been the story of his rise to national prominence, is the way he's flopped on supposedly issues of principle. But I think the really interesting dynamic here is the way the definition of cultural conservative is changing. If Mike Huckabee were so comfortable with the mantle of being the real cultural conservative in this race, then he wouldn't be having any problem with the stuff that's being dug out of his record now about being very vocally anti-gay, being particularly nasty about the issue of HIV and AIDS. Some of the other stuff that he said that might have fit very comfortably in Republican cultural conservatism in 2004 that now seems a little bit mean.
And I think he has to win in the suburbs, as you know, where in the big cities where people don't have the same views as that. Let's take a look at driving Miss Judy, it's been called. Here's Rudy Giuliani being questioned. Finally in this debate, something fascinating came up here about the expenses he paid as a New York mayor on behalf of the taxpayer to give security to his then-girlfriend, Judith Nathan.
The reality is that all that information was available and known to people, known 6 years ago. And I would make sure that government was transparent. My government in New York City was so transparent that they knew every single thing I did, almost every time I did it. So I would be extremely open. I'm used to it. I'm used to being analyzed. I haven't had a perfect life. I wish I had. And I do the best that I can to learn from my mistakes. But as far as, you know, open, transparent government, I think I've had both an open, transparent government and an open, transparent life. And it allows you to lead then with honesty and truth.
So are there things you could have done in this situation that would have been more open and not raise these concerns about obscuring public disclosure?
No, the reality is that this was a bookkeeping practice. The way it was done actually made it more available to Freedom of Information Act requests. Had it been done just in the police department, nobody would have ever found it. And everything that was laid out a few weeks ago had been laid out 6 years ago. Very well known. Some of the things that I wish, if I had led a perfect life, would have happened differently, but it was all very well known. And on the issue of transparency, I can't think of a public figure that's had a more transparent life than I've had.
Rudy Giuliani, transparent in the way he accounted for those security costs.
Chris, you got the body language experts coming on the next block. They're going to tell you, Giuliani, in that answer, his shoulders were drooping. He seemed weary. He seemed tired. He needs to change the conversation. He's been on defense for weeks now. He needs to change it and go on offense.
Rachel, your thoughts about whether the Loft Commission in New York was an appropriate place to charge the costs of the security detail on Judy Nathan?
That was some astonishing gymnastics, wasn't it? That he specifically wanted the account accounting to be done through the Office of the Advocate for People with Disabilities and the Office of the of Lawyers for People who can't afford them and the Loft Board, so that these things would be easier to find in the future through the Freedom of Information Act process. I mean, that bully's belief. It's just incredible that would be his line on this.
I'll put you down as a major contributor, by the way, Rachel, to the Alan Keyes campaign after tonight. You're on the list. You're his second, by the way, you're his second campaign worker. Anyway, Matt Continetti, Rachel Maddow, thank you for joining.